Hey everyone, my name is Rod Yates and you are listening to Behind the Beat, a Jaxsta podcast. This is where I talk to musicians and songwriters, managers, producers, pretty much anyone who works in the music industry about their lives and careers, the ups and downs of their journey and the lessons they've learned along the way. And my guest today is Fat Wreck Chords co-owner and co-founder Erin Kelly-Burkett. That was No Use for a Name with the song Not Your Saviour, taken from their album More Betterness, which Fat Wreck Chords released in 1999. Since starting in a one-bedroom house in San Francisco in 1990, Fat Wreck Chords has not only become one of the world's biggest punk rock labels, but one of the biggest independent labels full stop. They've released more than 300 albums by some of punk's biggest bands such as Rise Against, Sick of It All, Propaganda, Strung Out, Lagwagon, No Use for a Name, and many, many more. Most people probably associate the label with NoFX bassist Fat Mike, and it kind of makes sense. Fat Wreck Chords was his idea, he's been the face of the label since the start, and he has a huge profile thanks to the success of his band. But Fat Wreck Chords would not be the label it is today were it not for Erin Kelly-Burkett, who's been there from the beginning, working tirelessly behind the scenes as the label has weathered the ups and downs of 3 decades in the music industry. Erin is very funny, very cool, and very switched on, and she was happy to talk about everything from her upbringing to meeting Fat Mike and starting the label, how they built it into a global force in the wake of the punk rock boom in the mid-90s, and then had to face the prospect of closing only a few years later as piracy and illegal downloading took a toll. Erin is also really open about her relationship with Mike following their divorce in 2010, and how it is they've managed to actually keep working together since then. This conversation took place at the Big Sound Festival in Brisbane in September, and Erin had literally just come off stage from delivering the final keynote address. So there's a little bit of noise in the background. I guess the crew was bumping out the stage and packing things up, but I think we managed to block most of that out. Now, as anyone who is aware of NoFX and Fat Mike in particular will know, he is not a man overly concerned with convention or rules, and it's a mantra that's informed Fat Wreck Chords since day one, as you're about to find out. But we start by talking about why Erin has always been content working behind the scenes.
Because Mike is in such a famous band, it's such a big band, a lot of people just associate Fat Records with Mike.
Yeah.
And the honest truth is, for the last decade or so, if not longer, he's so busy doing other things. He's not really, other than signing bands, he's not really actively involved in the process.
Yeah. So is that frustrating for you to have that sort of perception out there that it's Fat Mike's label, whereas you're actually doing a lot of the work?
I'm not going to say it's never frustrating. It's definitely occasionally frustrating, but I also know that was my choice, because if I were a different personality type, I would be out there promoting myself. It's just not who I am. I don't feel like I need a lot of recognition. I don't feel like I need a lot of attention. I'm not a musician. It's not natural for me to be on the stage. All of my bands know me, and that have been making all of this work for the last 30 years. Yeah. I don't need the whole world to know it. But occasionally it happens where somebody's like, "Who are you and what?" But they're like Fat Records fans and they actually don't know who I am. And I'm like, wow, like, how is that a thing? That's kind of a bummer. But I also know it's my choice. Like, I'm just not a big self-promoter. So okay. I'm all about promoting my label and my bands, but I don't necessarily feel like I need to be like, but hey, what about me? I did this.
Yeah.
I don't need it.
And was that sort of set in place right from the beginning?
It definitely was, because the label was not my idea. It wasn't my dream. It was Mike's dream. You know, it became very natural, and it became a shared dream for the both of us. But he wanted to do it because he wanted to put out records initially it was just NoFX, but then it was about sort of just being able to do what you want to do without anybody having to be the boss of you. Mm. And he still lives by that. Yeah. Which led to a lot of, as you can imagine, running a record label with your husband and now ex-husband, because we were married for 22 years. That's like your whole life. So people often say that's a very interesting dynamic. Not only were you married, but then you somehow survived a divorce, and you're still working together. It's kind of like, I I feel like if you're going to spend 22 years of your life with somebody, you can't just walk away from it and then it feels like it didn't matter. Then it feels like it wasn't a mistake.
Right.
It wasn't an accident. Like, we retired. Like, 22 years of marriage, you're allowed to retire from that and just say, this is not working anymore. We're arguing more than we're getting along.
Yeah.
And nobody needs to live like that.
No.
Nobody should live like that. Once you get to the point where you are fundamentally disagreeing on this many issues, you shouldn't be together anymore.
Right. But how do you run a business like that if you are still fundamentally disagreeing
We
about
still
stuff?
fundamentally disagree on a lot. Because our hearts are in the same place. You know, we also have a child. So, to be fair, there isn't an option for me to not, like, to actually have a divorce. And by divorce, I mean a separation where we're not working together or seeing each other. That's not even an option because we have a child. And from my perspective, you cannot successfully co-parent if you aren't communicating and if you aren't, you know, I would never, for me to be in an argument with my ex or to be angry or that somehow feels to me like I'm somehow angry with my child because she's half his. And so I don't ever want to feel that I don't love that part of her as much as the part that is me,
Sure.
if that makes any sense. So,
total
like,
sense.
Mike and I don't we get along fine. We run the business fine. We raise our daughter fine. But we were not working anymore
Yeah.
as a married couple. But you don't just turn off love.
Of course.
Love is just there.
Yeah.
And Fat Records wouldn't survive without the both of us. I realized that. Like, there was a point at which I just thought, well, maybe I should just either start my own label or go out and do something else. But
Around the time of the divorce?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there wasn't really an option. I mean, Mike and I met when I was 17 years old. We started dating when I was 19 years old. Everything that we did together. For those 22 years, all of our experiences were shared experiences. This whole evolution of Fat and all of these friendships, all of our friends are mutual friends. Like, it's not an option to just say, well, we're all done. What am I going to do, like, just tap out and move to Australia?
Right.
It doesn't, and the bands are too important to me. These bands are some of my best friends.
Sure.
So I would feel that I'm letting them down.
Right. It's complicated.
It's very complicated. And it's certainly not easy all the time. I do think that because Mike is so busy with other projects, his musical and his band and various other things that he devotes his time to, it is easier because I'm in the office every day. He's not in the office unless I say we need to have a meeting. But he travels a lot, and so a lot of it is email and phone calls. And other than deciding new bands that we want to sign, he lets me have the freedom that I need to be able to make the decisions that will keep us running without having to have, I'm trying to not use the word argument, but I'm going to use the word argument about it.
Has it always been that way with the relationship? Because you kind of brought the business brain
Yes.
when you go back all the way to when
Yeah.
Fat Wreck started.
I think it's an interesting dynamic because it was always like that. I was always the finance person and the business end of it, and he was always the creative, and I was always reeling him back in. He's always been eccentric and a little bit unpredictable and a little bit just sort of crazy. That was always the case. But when we were actually a couple, that was easier to manage, I think, because we were a couple. It was easier for me to sort of like reel him in and tone it down a little bit. But that was also what made it work because he's a risk taker and I'm not. I was always very cautious and very wary and very like nervous about like, oh, I don't know. And he's always, let's do it. He doesn't like to think about things or talk about it. I'm not trying to say he doesn't think. He thinks, but he doesn't like to think about something for too long. He just wants to get it done.
Can that get you in trouble as a business?
All the time.
What springs to mind?
All the time. I mean, he just dives in sometimes and without really thinking through the consequences of everything. I feel that it's our job to have a level playing field, have an equal platform with all of our bands. I think it's super important to treat all of our bands the same. And it's not to say that I don't have favorite bands. Of course I have favorite bands, but I have always felt that like if a band has sold a certain number of records and I give them a certain royalty rate, that royalty rate should also be applicable to every other band that's sort of at that same level.
Yeah.
I don't like... I want the bands to know that they're being treated fairly. And Mike has always just sort of been kind of like a loose cannon with that kind of stuff, where he's just like, he'll agree to something and maybe doesn't remember exactly what he agreed to. Like, so I go around just sort of like fixing things a lot.
Right. You're like the wolf of this business.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how old were you when you got into punk rock?
I was 14 years old. So I grew up in a really small town in Northern California near Sacramento, but it was like 2 hours away. And there was, my school, I went to a small high school and there were no punkers at all. There were heshers. There were like metalheads.
What's a hesher?
It's like somebody who listens to metal. I guess it's probably like a California term.
Okay.
I'm guessing. Heshers, yeah. So there was like, the like rockers essentially, but there was no punk.
Yeah.
And then there were like the jocks that just like everybody was super into football, and then there were the ags, and those were the people that were into like the agricultural. Those were like the cliques, like if you look at a '90s movie like right now, like Breakfast Club or something, our cliques were the heshers and the jocks and the ags, and I was like, I don't fit into any of these cliques. I felt totally displaced and completely like these are not my people. And then one day this transfer student was in for a year, but ended up staying for the rest of the high school years, and she was Dutch, and I thought she was just the coolest thing I'd ever seen, and she had like half of her head shaved and like sort of a faux mohawk and all these piercings, and she dressed really cool, and I was totally in love with her. I just thought she was the greatest thing ever, and she hated me. Just wanted absolutely positively nothing to do with me. But to be fair, she hated everybody at the school. She was clearly miserable, did not want to be there. Her parents like forced her out of Holland and shoved her in this, podunk middle of nowhere town.
Yeah.
She was miserable, and I just kept working on her. And I was like, we're going to be best friends. You're going to love me. Finally, I broke her down, yeah. And to be fair, I owe everything to this girl, Janine Kornman, who I've heard, we've lost touch, but she did move. I've heard she moved back to Holland and is currently living in Amsterdam.
Okay.
Anyway, if she hadn't introduced me to punk, I would like to think that somehow I would have, fallen into it somewhere along the way, but it really was just that sort of like 14-year-old angst of like just, that frenzy, like every teenager goes through it. Mm-hmm. Like our daughter is 13 and sadly she's starting to go through it, and I could not be less impressed with any. I'm just like, I feel like a grandma when I'm like, I say to her, well, sweetheart, I remember what it felt like. And I'm like, oh my God, how is that coming out of my mouth?
Is it history repeating? Were you a rebellious kid?
But the difference is that we are very, as you can imagine, we are very open, laid back, sort of like, we're not strict at all. If Fat Mike is your dad, clearly you're not having a very strict conservative upbringing. Right. We are very liberal, and she can talk to me about anything. So the difference is my parents were so strict, I had to lie to do anything fun. Because I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or do anything, and they for sure weren't going to let me go to shows that were an hour and a half away or 2 hours away and stay out past my curfew. I couldn't possibly go to see punk bands and be back by 10 o'clock at night. That's like, doesn't work.
Right.
That's not a thing. So I had to lie. I was forced into the lie.
Right.
I'm not a natural born liar. I really just thought we weren't going to have these problems because they thought, like, if you have cool parents,
sure.
I'm not trying to say I'm cool, but
yeah.
I'm a hell of a lot cooler than my parents were.
Well, what did your parents do?
My dad worked for the state of California. He worked for the government, essentially, in Health and Human Services. So just sort of like a bureaucratic kind of, dare I say, boring job. And my mom actually has a PhD in psychology and is a therapist. Well, was. She's retired. But the problem with them was that they were raised, they're both from, my dad's Irish Catholic and my mom's Italian Catholic. And so they were both raised in very strict religious families. They were virgins when they got married. Like, how is that even a thing? Like, that to me, how could you possibly marry somebody you've not slept with? Like, I can't even, that seems to me like the most basic compatibility test for can we be married?
Yeah.
Does this work?
Yeah.
So they got married and had sex for the first time on their wedding night. Of course it wasn't going to work out. And so they got divorced when I was 9, and then all hell sort of broke loose because my mom realized I've only ever been with one man my entire life, and then she just sort of decided, I'm going to go crazy. Unfortunately, I was 7.
Yeah.
And she was like, I'm just going to start sleeping around. So my dad was like still super, super strict, and my mom turned into a complete crazy like hippie who was just like free love and like just when I was like 7.
Were you living with her? Or
Yeah, I was living with my mom.
Right.
It was weird. It was super weird. So to be fair, I kind of parented myself. And so I had a very, very strict upbringing up until about 7.
Okay.
And then I only saw my dad every other weekend. And he's also a very, the way that he was raised is the way that he raised us, which was very, very standoffish. Mm-hmm. You're not friends with your children. You are there to dictate to them how they need to behave. So I didn't really look forward to going to visit my dad because he was scary. He was very, you got yelled at a lot for doing things that just seemed like, I can't believe I'm actually in trouble for that. Like, open up the refrigerator and there was already like a bottle of juice that was open, but I accidentally took the other one and like took the new bottle of juice, and like then you're just getting yelled at. Like this kind of like, it creates this sort of like anxiety and panic where you just feel like you're always in trouble. So of course, even though my mom was acting crazy, I chose to live with my mom, and then she was just never there. So I just sort of raised myself.
Well, like never there, like you had to get yourself to school and feed yourself?
Well, we walked to school. So, because I grew up in the country.
Right.
So I had to walk like, I don't know, like a mile or something down to the bus, and the bus would take me to school, and then the bus would drop me off at the bus stop, and I'd walk a mile home, and you just had a latchkey. You were like latchkey kid.
Yeah.
Just had a key around your neck and went in, did your homework, fixed yourself a sandwich, went to bed. Maybe your mom was coming home. Maybe your mom wasn't coming home. Wake up in the morning. Maybe she'd be there. Maybe she wouldn't. Make your own cereal. Off you go again. There's a lot of that.
And so did you see something in punk when you heard it that I don't know,
yeah,
provided
I felt
a sense
like I had
of
a family.
A family, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, positively. I felt like I had a family. And to be honest, that was the whole attraction for me. That was the first time I remember feeling like I fit in, and that people, like I felt like they would care for me, like there was a community, like they would look out for you, like people that you didn't even know, but like they love the Circle Jerks, and you love the Circle Jerks, and so you're just at the same show. I mean, it sounds so cliche and so hippy dippy, but it's true.
Yeah.
That was the first time I ever felt like I fit in, and that I had found a community of people that were actually going to look out for me and make sure that I was okay. Because I didn't really have that in my parents.
Wow,
and
okay.
even when Mike and I met, he has his own family issues, and that had always been a huge part of our relationship. We believed in chosen family. I don't personally feel, there are a lot of people that believe that, that whole blood is thicker than water thing. And for example, my sister, I get along fine with my sister. I love my sister. My sister has a much better relationship with my parents because she believes that it doesn't matter how family treats you, it's still family. Family is family, so you have to forgive them and you have to forget about it and just move on because it's family. I don't actually think that. Mm-hmm. I think you have to earn a place in my life, and you have to earn a place in my daughter's life, and if you haven't earned it, then you can't be there.
Right.
So Mike and I, from the very beginning, were all about chosen family, and that is a huge part of, I think, why Fat Records is still here, and why it became the label that it did. I know it sounds cliche, but it is a true story. These people are my best friends, and we grew up together, doing this together.
Stay with us on Behind the Beat to hear about Fat Mike's incredible response when asked in a business meeting about the label's 5-year plan. Welcome back to Behind the Beat. I'm Rod Yates, and I'm talking to Fat Records co-owner and co-founder Erin Kelly-Burkett. One of the key parts of the story of Fat Records is the relationship between Erin and her ex-husband, Fat Mike, and we pick up the conversation talking about how they met and started the label.
It was certainly not any kind of like a love connection in the beginning. Like, it really wasn't. We just were really, really good friends. I thought that Mike was one of the funniest people I'd ever met, and he was really smart, and I just liked his perspective. I just liked how he saw the world.
Okay.
It was fascinating.
And so how far along then did the idea for Fat Wreck happen?
So then we were friends for 2 years, and then we started dating. Let's see, we got married in 1992, and we had started the label in 1990. So we were actually not even married when we started it.
Okay.
And it was out of our kitchen. At the time, we had moved in together, and we had stayed in one of those in San Francisco. They have all these old Victorians, and at the time, again, nobody has any money. So you would move in with a bunch of other couples. We lived in a house that had 6 other couples. So there was 12 of us. So, like, we turned a living room into a bedroom and a family room into a bedroom and all of that. And the first place that we managed to get, when we scraped enough money together, we had our own one-bedroom apartment, and that was heaven. I remember thinking, like, we're cool.
Right.
This is really cool.
We're
growing up. We've got our own one-bedroom apartment. We have no roommates. If I ever learned how to cook, I have a kitchen. I could totally cook in it. But that's where we started Fat Records. And
that kitchen became your storeroom.
Yeah, that kitchen was it. And there was just, orders and invoices and records and boxes and crap everywhere. Like, it spilled out from the kitchen and into the living room. And it became this labor of, like, I was exhausted because I was working full-time at a public relations firm, making the money to pay the rent. And Mike just kept going on tour.
Yeah.
And orders would just stack up, and I was like, well, I guess I have to do this. Because I felt bad because people were sending money in.
Yeah.
And, like, actually, at that time, there was a lot of money orders, too. Like, they would go to the post office and get a money order. Does anyone do that anymore? Is that even a thing?
I don't think so.
I don't think that's a thing.
No.
Anyway, money orders would have coming in. There's, like, all this money. I'm like, well, I have to do it. So I'd work 8 hours a day, come home from work, and then sit in my kitchen and stuff all these orders, and then box up the ones for the distributors, which are the big boxes, and then drop them off at the post office on my way to work the next day. And after a few months of that, I was exhausted. I was like, this isn't working. Like, are you going to actually get someone to do this, or are you going to ask me to do it? Because you're not really asking me. You're just sort of leaving and assuming that I'm going to take care of this. So maybe we should, like, talk about this.
Right.
And then we sort of, like, had a conversation about it.
But it's one thing to say, all right, we're going to start a label. I know Mike wanted to get his music out there with no effects and not have a boss.
Yeah.
But it's another thing to then learn about distribution, promotion, legals, finance.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Well, you sort of just learn it as you go along, honestly. But at the time, when NoFX was living, NoFX, as you know, was on Epitaph for a period of time.
Yeah.
And Mike interned there, didn't work, but interned there when we were in the early stages of starting Fat. He had done an internship at Epitaph and sort of picked up just enough knowledge about distribution channels.
Okay.
Kind of to figure out how this actually works. And the rest of it was sort of common sense, to be honest.
Yeah.
We needed some names. We needed some connections. We needed some companies. We needed to figure out how do you get things manufactured and how do you get someone to pick up your distribution. And we needed contacts. But it wasn't that hard because we had friends that were sort of, friends of ours were on Epitaph Records, and Epitaph Records at that time was like,
huge. Yeah.
That was the label if you were in this industry, this genre of music.
Yeah.
And so we had enough people that we knew, and we asked a lot of questions, and a lot of it was just common sense.
Okay. Trial and error?
Yeah, exactly.
Was there a lot of error?
I mean, sure. We definitely learned that you don't get paid at all if you don't put out a new record.
Right.
Distributors just won't pay you. Like they'll order 150 copies of vinyl or whatever, and you ship it out. And then at that time they were on like 60-day terms.
Okay.
So you have to wait 60 days before they would pay you. And then 60 days would roll around, and you still don't have any money. And then you'd start sending them, notices and invoices. Are you going to pay us? They're like, well, what new records do you have coming out?
Oh, so it's almost like hold you to ransom.
Yeah. And that was I said in the early days, but it's like, to be honest, it's not necessarily not like that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need distributors as much as we used to.
Yeah.
It was different then.
Of course.
But so we quickly found out, if we don't keep putting out new music, we're actually never going to get paid for the old music.
Wow. So,
Yeah.
but what were you living on at that point? You had just your day job, is that?
I eventually quit. For the first year that I was actually when we decided that I needed to be part of it and I was going to work it. It was also I was the only one who had any business
Yeah.
experience. So Mike has always been very creative and he's always been sort of the idea guy. But in terms of actually running the fundamentals of what it takes to run a business, that's never been what he did. That's always been what I did.
Okay.
And so initially it was just me sort of stepping in and fixing things along the way. And then I finally realized this is going to take me less time. If I just do it versus fix it, it's going to be, it takes less time
Sure.
to do it right the first time.
Yep.
Then pick it all up and put it all back together. So we did that. And for the first year, I think my job agreed to let me do part-time. And so I cut down from 40 hours a week to 20 hours a week. So I was still sort of working. And then around that time, NoFX started to actually get paid to tour.
Right.
So he was bringing in a little bit of money, and I was bringing in a little bit of money, and it took us 2 years before we actually turned a profit.
Okay.
But we were okay.
Sure.
I mean, it was really different in those days. I didn't feel like I needed anything. If you could pay your rent and you could afford to get a tall one, and you could maybe sneak your way into a show.
Yep.
If you had booze and somewhere to sleep.
Yeah.
It was all right.
That was it.
Maybe some top ramen.
Right.
I didn't have a lot of needs back then.
But it grew pretty quickly because you had Lagwagon came on board, Propaganda, No Use for a Name.
Yeah.
So at that point, you've actually got bands coming to you, presumably.
Yeah.
And it starts to feel like a real business.
It did. When we actually started making money, I'm not going to lie, I was really surprised. Because I had never thought, 30 years ago, I never thought this was going to be something I would still be doing.
Yeah.
I was consistently surprised that it kept turning a profit year after year after year.
Right. You didn't have a business plan or anything, did you?
We never had a business plan. I remember our first, the biggest distributor that we have ever worked with was a company that was called Red Distribution, and they're owned by Sony. And 20 years ago or something, when we landed that big distributor, that was huge for us because that really opened up the channels of where we could get the music, where we were able to get our music out. And that really helped us broaden a lot. So that was a big deal for us. And I remember we were sitting in a meeting and the president, it was just a meeting of suits, and then, Mike with green hair and me with pink, or Mike's farting through the meeting, and it was just... But there's just suits lining this giant, long row of table. And the president, I think his name was Ken Antonelli at the time, said, "So what do you see? What is your 5-year plan for Fat Records?" And we'd never been in a business meeting. We'd never had a business plan. We don't have a 5-year plan. And Mike stood up, and he went, "We're going to go like this." That was his answer. We're going to plummet to the ground like a plane crashing into the sea. And I was like, oh, that's cool.
What was the response?
They didn't know what to do with us. No clue what to do with us. But our records were selling really well. There was a decade, I call it the glory days, when everything we put out sold 100,000 copies.
Yeah.
And it was easy. It was so weird. It's not now. I mean, obviously a whole different ballgame, but we didn't have a ton of marketing experience or promotional experience. We didn't. I'm not saying we didn't put money into promoting the bands. Of course we did, but we didn't really know what we were doing. So we did a lot of trial and error, but also those bands that were selling 100,000 copies, it was surprising.
Because that's a lot.
It's a lot.
Right.
For an indie label, that's a lot.
And I presume this is kind of post-94, is it? So 94 happens, The Offspring release Smash,
Yeah.
Green Day released Dookie,
Yeah.
Punk is on MTV,
Yeah.
it
Exactly.
explodes.
I remember when Offspring come out and play. That was a huge deal for all of us. I remember because back then we still listened to the radio. And I remember because at that time, NoFX still had some records on Epitaph. We were also putting out some stuff on Fat, but they had records on Epitaph. So they were label mates on Epitaph. And so Offspring and NoFX had done a lot of tours together. We were all friends. I remember listening to the radio and hearing that, and we went, what the hell just happened? Was that Offspring? We were shocked. It was a big deal. It was this massive buzz. It was crazy.
Yeah.
So there was a time where we just thought oh, maybe this is a thing that could happen. Well, then we realized that was not a thing that was going to happen. It was a thing that was happening to the Offspring and Green Day, and that's
Right.
it.
But the flow through to the label was...
Yes. Yeah.
But with that, I guess, growth in the label and the growth in the scene, does that bring with it its own set of unique problems that you didn't have before?
I think it brings the problems of the band's expectations. Because, again, we never had expectations of being able to cross that level, you know? We do what we do very well now. And I still think we did it pretty well for not knowing exactly what we were doing, even in the early days. We did a pretty good job. We're better now, but we were okay then. But we never made promises to any of the bands. We basically said, you know, we're going to pay for your recording. We'll give you a budget. You can pick the engineer that you want. We'll pay for the studio. You can take the master. You know, like here's your budget, and then we'll get you on tours. You'll pay for a van or, you know, your flights or whatever. We'll give you tour advances and we'll get you on tours. And at the time, because NoFX was doing so well, it worked really well because we started doing Fat tours that NoFX would headline, and then we'd put all of our bands on those Fat tours. That was great.
Right.
Because it was such great exposure for all of our smaller bands, and that was a huge lure for people wanting to sign.
Sure.
But the only thing that changed when stuff blew up, like Offspring and Green Day, was a little bit sometimes of bands' expectations of like, oh, is this a thing you guys can do? And we never promised it because I thought, I don't know. I'm pretty sure we can't do that. Right. If you want that, maybe you should go to Epitaph because I don't think that's going to happen here.
Right.
We can give you a lot of things and we'll spell it all out.
Yeah.
And we'll deliver what we promise.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen for you.
Even so, Fat Records still enjoyed a hugely successful period in the 90s, but the good times couldn't last forever. And when we come back from this break, Erin talks about the moment she thought Fat Records might have to close its doors. Welcome back to Behind the Beat. I'm Rod Yates, and I'm talking to Fat Records co-owner and co-founder Erin Kelly-Burkett. Now, I mentioned at the start of the podcast that Fat Records have never been bothered with doing things the traditional way, and that extends to their attitude to contracts, as you're about to find out. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you never really bothered with contracts. Is that right? Or
No, it's true.
You would sign bands to one,
Yes.
album deals?
Both of those things are true. A lot of our early bands, we've never had contracts. I think there is in existence one Lagwagon Duh contract. So the very first record they put out, I think we did have a contract. But they've never had one since. Every record since then that they've been putting out with us for the last 27 years, is that right? Whatever it is, has just been a conversation and a handshake.
Right.
And bands like No Use for Name, again, I think maybe I think their first record, I think we had a contract. And that was sort of because we have had the same lawyer, this entertainment lawyer, her name is Stacey Fast. She's amazing, and she's a great friend of ours. But she's been in the industry, and she worked with major labels as well. And it was her recommendation in the early days, well, you have to get a contract. But we never had more than a one-record deal. We always believed that if a band is happy with us, then they're going to come back. And if we've done our job and we've delivered what we've promised and we've been honest and they have, then there's no reason why they wouldn't come back. And I would never want a band to stay simply because they couldn't leave.
Yeah.
You should be able to leave if you want to. And we've had bands leave, you know that.
Yeah.
But we've had a lot more bands stay. We've also had bands leave and come back.
So you never worry about leaving yourself open to, like, by not having a contract, you're never concerned that it's going to bite you?
No.
That's crazy.
Now that I just said that. I think my lawyer worries about it sometimes. This is the thing. I feel that this community that we're in and this family that we've built, neither one of us want to burn each other.
Right.
Because it's a mutual respect thing. So I believe inherently that people are good.
Okay.
And I think that people, for the most part, are honest and loyal, and that they will treat you the same. If you treat them that way, then you're going to get the same in return.
Yeah.
So I don't think that we would be attracted to a band that we would want to be on Fat Records that felt insecure without having a contract.
Okay. So in 94 or post 94, in that decade since, how big did the company get? How many people were you employing?
It got pretty big. We had so the U.S. office at one time we had about 25 employees. And then we also had opened up, we called it Fat Australia and Fat Japan and Fat Canada. What it was one person in each of those territories. But it was still, an office.
Sure.
And that to me got a little bit scary because that started to feel like less of a family and more of a business. And that made me nervous because then there was also a lot at stake. There were a lot of people depending on the salary that we were, generating for them. And that felt like a lot of pressure to me. It made me a little nervous. Mike was always about expansion and branching out. And again, he's always been the risk taker, and I've always been very cautious.
Yeah.
I always tend to hold back. So that made me nervous. And then, when the digital era came in and blew everything up, obviously that was a problem. And our overhead was so high at that point, we had to downsize.
Right. So that's happening. So yes, digital era comes through.
Yeah.
Napster comes through.
Yeah.
People are taking music for free.
Yes.
How does that affect you? You mentioned that you have to downsize, but...
It affected us because that was the first time that there was so much piracy going on that there actually became a prevalent attitude of young kids feeling like they don't need to pay for it. And that was strange to me because at the time I remember my sister has 4 boys, and my nephews were part of that generation of feeling like music should be free. And I remember having a conversation with my nephew Derek and saying, what do you mean music should be free? Do you understand that if you don't actually pay for this, that musician is not actually going to be able to create this art anymore because they should be able to be compensated for their art. And this is their job. This is their work. This is what they do. If that guy has to go out and get a job at McDonald's, how's he going to be able to tour? How's he going to be able to write music? And he was like, it was the most foreign concept to my nephew at the time. It's like, well, you shouldn't have to pay for it. Like, it was really scary. At that time, I thought Fat might actually go under.
Really?
Yeah. That was the only time I ever thought maybe this isn't going to work. Because no one bought records anymore.
And you actually lost money for, I guess, the first time in quite a long time.
Yep. 2 years in a row. We took money out of our personal private accounts and fed money into the business to pay royalties. When it came time, that was the first time ever that when it came time for us to pay royalties, we didn't have enough money in the bank. And we pay royalties twice a year.
Yep.
So we do them biannually. And I think it was 3 royalty periods in a row where we had to borrow money from ourselves to put money into the bank at the FAT account to pay it out. And after the 3rd royalty session, I remember saying to Mike, we can't do this. We're going to go broke. This isn't going to work. So we drastically reduced. We closed Canada and Japan, Australia. And we laid off, I think, half of our staff.
What was that like? Because you've built, family is so important to you, and Fat Wreck represented family.
It was horrible. It was horrible. I felt like we'd let everybody down. I felt it was hard because, again, we were also very, very close with our employees. When we organized those Fat tours, we would take trips together. We paid for our entire staff of like 22 people to fly to Japan. We paid for our entire staff of 22 people to fly to Hawaii because we thought it'd be fun to have a Hawaii vacation, so we booked like a show on Maui and a show on Oahu and a show on Kauai, and just we were a family.
Yeah.
It felt terrible. In fact, I couldn't do it. I couldn't participate in any of those. All of the laying off, Mike did.
Right.
I couldn't do it. I actually said I can't be part of this. I don't know how. But if we hadn't downsized, we would have gone under.
Okay.
We would have run out of money.
Was your head spinning at this point? Were you just thinking, did you see any of this coming? Was it out of the blue?
It was kind of out of the blue. I thought it was weird. It was like that was a whole new platform. It was a whole new, the thing about the music industry now, I know in retrospect, is that it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, and you constantly are finding new ways to keep up with it.
Yeah.
When streaming came along, we didn't have the technology built into our accounting system to actually track the streams and pay our bands. We had to go out and hire a company to come in and build from the ground up a brand new royalty system so that we could track all of this and pay our bands accurately. because the technology keeps changing and we didn't actually have the power to harness it and monetize it. We didn't know how to do it. And that, and I think when that happened, when we had to drastically downsize, I realized, okay, well, maybe this is just a blip. Maybe this is like a growing pain. Maybe this is gonna, and it did turn around, but it was rough for a bit.
Yeah, how long? How long do you think it was, how long was it rough?
I feel like it was rough for about 5 years.
That's a long time.
It wasn't rough from the point of having to borrow money to pay the band's royalties, but the good news is we borrowed money to pay the band's royalties. What other labels did was stop paying the band's royalties. We borrowed money to make sure that they got paid.
After the break, Erin talks about how Fat Records has evolved in the streaming era and what the future holds for the label. Welcome back to Behind the Beat. I'm Rod Yates, and I'm talking to Fat Records co-owner and co-founder, Erin Kelly-Burkett. Before the break, Erin was talking about the digital revolution and the impact that it had on Fat Records, and like all labels, Fat Wreck had to work out a way to survive until a new business model had evolved, which is where we pick up the conversation. So, you downsized. Were there any other measures that you took to work your way out of that patch to become still sustainable?
Well, we just sort of waited for the industry to turn around a little bit. But I remember being upset because that was the first time that I had measured our success in terms of our bands. If they were able to earn a living off of their royalties and their touring income and not have day jobs, from my perspective, we were succeeding. Mm-hmm. That was how I gauged it. Mm-hmm. And the majority of our early bands didn't have day jobs. They lived as artists and were able to have families and get a house and do all of that based on their music, which to me was a great success. And when that piracy started taking over and that attitude changed and people stopped paying for music, that stopped because they weren't buying records anymore, so they weren't earning royalties anymore, mm-hmm. or the ones that they, what the numbers that they used to earn. Mm-hmm. They had to start touring all the time. Mm-hmm. So the only way for them to make a living now was to tour. So our bands that used to be happy touring maybe 3 or 4 months out of the year, and by this time we're older now, so people have families and they mm-hmm. have to leave their babies. Suddenly bands are touring 9 and 10 months out of the year, never home, because it's the only way they can earn a living.
Yeah.
That sucked.
Does it take the fun out of it? That's a sacrifice.
I think that becomes more of a job and less of a, the successful musicians are in it because they love music. Yeah. Because they love the art. They love writing. They love playing. They love performing. If you don't love it, you can't. No one's in it for the money anymore. It just doesn't. That's not a thing. I don't think that's a sustainable thing. You can't do this life if you're not passionate about it. Sure. But to a certain extent, if you feel like you have to go on tour for 9 or 10 months out of the year, that becomes a job and a chore. Yeah. I meant actually, from your perspective, does it take the fun out of it knowing that that's what... Yes, it does. Because then it made me feel like I let everybody down. I didn't do anything, but it did feel like we got to figure out a way out of this. And thank God, as we know now, they did figure out a way to monetize all of that. Sure. And it worked its way out. But it was rough. And so how did streaming change the business? Well, streaming allowed our bands, again, streaming became the new platform where people heard music, which was great because from initially before they figured out how to get paid on it, it was good for promotion mm-hmm. because why wouldn't you stream something? You don't have to pay for it. Right. Why wouldn't you listen to a record that you might not buy? Sure. Because you don't have to pay. But then once they worked around that and figured out a way to actually pay them, that became a really good marketing tool as well. So instead of being angry at streaming because it was taking away from sales, you just figure out a way to boost the sales. Yeah. So that was huge. Okay. So you're kind of constantly, have you found that in this job you're constantly having to reinvent? Yes. Yeah, and more so in the last... Yes. Right. Definitely. You have to, and they just keep coming up with new ways of getting music out there. There's so many different technologies evolving every day.
Yeah.
I mean, if I have meetings with distributors sometimes and they're using lingo and I don't know what the hell they're talking about. And I feel like an old lady where I'm just like, I have to like pretend that I sort of know what they're talking about. And then after the meeting's over, then like go back to like one of my 20-something employees and go, what was this? Well, I don't know what they're talking. What is this? I'm trying to think of an example, but I can't think of one off the top of my head, but it just recently happened.
Right.
And I didn't even know what they were talking about.
So does that then make you think that you need someone younger to come in and help with that side of the business, or not really?
I don't think we need it, but it can't hurt.
Okay.
You know, I think that if you're going to stay relevant in this industry, you definitely need younger. You need to at least have a fresher perspective.
Yeah.
You need access to it at least, and also because we're, you know, the young bands are really fun to work with because they're hungry and they're not jaded yet and they're not over it yet. Like, they're the people that they're so excited to go on a trip to Australia that they can't wait to hold a koala. And, you know, the older bands like No Effects are like, well, I've been to Australia like 100 times and I don't really care about holding a koala anymore. Like that kind of, and that sucks the fun out of it.
Sure.
I mean, Mike used to have this saying all the time when we would go on tour and he wouldn't ever want to do anything. And he was like, doing things is overrated. I'm like, I'm so sick of sitting on this tour bus and I've been touring all of the world and all I see is a tour bus and a backstage venue and maybe a hotel if I'm lucky.
Yeah.
That's it. Doing things is not overrated. Doing things is fun.
Uh-huh.
We held koalas yesterday and it was great.
Had you done that before?
I had done it before, but it's been a long time. I haven't been to Australia in, my daughter's 13 and I was pregnant the last time I was here, so 13 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And Australia's been pretty good for Fat in terms of the bands.
It has.
Down here.
What's interesting for us is that we have had some distribution issues here. Mm-hmm. You know, when we were working with Shock, that worked really, really well for us for a while, and then Shock had some problems, and we shared those problems with them.
Yeah.
Our bands have still successfully been able to tour here really well. It's a good market for our bands. We're still trying to bridge that gap. Like the Shock thing hit us pretty hard. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to get the physical product out as much as we would like it to be.
Okay.
Because it's definitely a bummer for us when our bands are over here and they're touring and they go into a record store and their stuff isn't there. Like that makes you feel like you're not doing your job.
Yeah.
I mean, we still sell well over here, but most of it is digital.
Yep.
You know, thank God for that technology existing, because otherwise our bands wouldn't actually be able to get paid and come over here and have successful tours. So that part of it's great. We're figuring it out, but it's just the part of the problem is that a lot of distribution companies won't deal with you anymore unless you give them your digital.
Right.
And I have firmly maintained from the beginning I don't give digital to anybody.
Okay.
Because we have a direct account with iTunes.
Yep.
And we're one of the few labels that does not go through a distributor, like at least in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And that has sort of like become our policy worldwide.
Right.
Because I don't feel that I don't know why I would give up digital when I can get a bigger share for my bands and for my label, and the distributor's sort of just in the way of that. They're not doing anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make any sense to me.
Of course.
So I never gave it up.
Right.
And that's a problem.
It is a problem?
It's a problem with new distributors being willing to pick up where Shock left off.
Okay.
Because they won't just do the physical, they want a piece of the digital.
Right.
And my argument is, why would I give you a piece of the digital? You're not doing anything for it.
Yeah, sure.
If you want to offer me a pitch, if you want to tell me what you're going to actually deliver to me by getting a piece of this digital, great.
Yeah.
There's never an answer.
Yeah.
Because there isn't anything. You don't have to do anything.
Right.
I'm doing all the work over here. The bands are doing all the work over here, and you're doing nothing but taking a chunk of that money. That doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. A lot of the stuff in the music industry doesn't make sense.
I know.
Does it?
So that's why I won't give it up, and that's why we're having an issue.
Right. So 27 years into Fat,
Yeah.
you're still putting out fires.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Here's the thing. Nothing worth doing it's not, I mean, life is interesting and fun and crazy and dramatic, and, you know, there's just going to be a constantly evolving chain of events that is sort of chaotic at times and lovely, but also chaotic. And we're still putting out fires because for example, Mike is still, NoFX has been out there offending people for 30 years. Mm-hmm. It's not going to change.
Yep.
It is what it is.
Yep.
Mike likes to just say what he wants and do what he wants, and just he is who he is.
Uh-huh.
And that's great because it helped build Fat Records.
Yep.
At the same time, it is also difficult sometimes because I prefer a little less drama.
Yeah.
I love my life.
Yeah.
I think it's great. I'm so lucky to be able to do what I do, and I have amazing family and network of friends and a great daughter and an awesome partner and this life that I like. Who gets to do this every day, something that they're truly passionate about? I'm lucky.
Yeah.
So sometimes I do get a little frustrated that the drama isn't just a little bit like, let's just all enjoy the music and be happy. But you know what? We wouldn't be where we are if there wasn't that element of chaos.
Yeah. For a company that never had a business plan, do you have any sort of plan for the next 5?
I mean,
10
I feel like I could do this for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. If there was ever a time when I was thinking at all about not being part of Fat, that was when Mike and I split up, because obviously that was not easy. If we got along on a fundamental level, we'd still be married. We don't, so that's difficult. But I also realized that if I were to not be part of Fat Records, it wouldn't work. It doesn't work without the both of us. It just truly does not. And I love my bands so much that I would never, ever abandon them. So you just figure out new ways to make things work. And I think I'll probably be doing this, forever.
And you mentioned Darla earlier.
Yeah.
Can you ever see a day where she shows an interest in taking in the family business?
God, I wish. I know, it's weird, right? Because I thought, again, feeling like you're a cool parent, I thought that her life that she's been blessed with, she travels everywhere with us. She has been all over the world. I didn't even have a passport till I was 22 years old. I didn't leave the country until I was 22 years old. She was out of pages and had to get a new passport when she was 6. Because we traveled too much.
Sure.
And I would think that would be an exciting lifestyle for her. I have a series of photographs that I've taken from the time she was a wee baby up until now, 13 years old, where she's sitting on the side of a stage at some big music festival and she's sleeping, leaning her head on the cabinet. I'm she's just bored out of her skull. And I have one from every year of her life. She's unimpressed with the whole entire thing. I don't know.
Right.
I mean, she doesn't she likes some of the bands. She doesn't like a lot of them.
Okay.
She likes the more poppy bands, like Teenage Bottle Rocket or the Bomb Pops, or she loved Masked Intruder for a phase. And I try not to force her to watch them, but if we're traveling, I think it's disrespectful. You need to watch your dad play. You need to watch Uncle Joey play. Sure. It's rude if we're at a Lagwagon show and you're not going to at least watch your uncle, play. But then she'll say things to me like, Mom, I don't want to watch Dad play. He embarrasses me. And then she'll be like, he's not wearing any underwear underneath that skirt. I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to make you watch this anymore. I don't know. She's unimpressed.
Well,
I mean, she learned what a blowjob was from her dad talking on stage. She was 7 or 8. I don't think she actually knew exactly what it was, but she came back to me and said, Mom, what's a blowjob? And I was like, oh my God, seriously? Your daughter's standing right there. You can't tone it down for one set? One set. Nope.
Just nope.
No, just nope. She's like, you should know better than that. I'm not going to filter myself for anybody. Okay, cool. Now I get to answer the question, what's a blowjob? Thanks. That's really great.
And that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening, and a big thanks to Erin Kelly-Burkett for chatting with me. Thanks also to Lachlan Mitchell from Parliament Studios in Sydney for engineering this podcast, and to Sam Lockwood for writing the theme and incidental music. And remember, for all your music credits and to get the story behind the music, head to Jaxsta.com. Until the next episode of Behind the Beat, I'm Rod Yates. Thanks for listening.